the young participants here, spinal tumors can be of two types. They can be primary tumors, or there may be a tumor somewhere else in the body which has spread to the spine, in which case this tumor which has spread is called as a metastasis. And the secondary effects of the metastasis on the spine, namely pathological fracture, instability, deformity, constitutes what is called as a spinal metastatic disease. In the good old days, patients with metastasis used to hardly survive, because by the time it is metastasis, there is stage 4. But with modern chemotherapy, hormonal therapy, radiotherapy, and aggressive surgery, patients with metastatic disease are surviving longer and longer. And therefore, we as spine surgeons come into play because these patients are referred to us for treatment. By the time a person dies, it is estimated, if you do an autopsy on these patients, almost 80% of them will have a metastasis in the spine. Spine, in fact, is the most common organ after lung and liver to develop a metastatic disease. In a paper I did, which was published in 2003, we looked at about 600 patients. And what we found was that most common primary tumors that metastasize to the spine include firstly breast, lung, and prostate. These are the most common. These are followed by kidney, thyroid, and then of course colon, sarcomas, GI tumors, etc. What are the portals? How does the spine, the metastasis from a primary tumor spread to the spine? It can spread via the arterial route, the most common among them being the lung. It can spread via the Watson's venous plexus because of back pressure changes, which is commonly seen with prostate. Breast tumor spreads to the spine through the lymphatic route. And of course, tumors which are close to the spine can contiguously spread to the spine, such as thyroid cancers and retroperitoneal tumors. Within the spine, there is some controversy as which is the most common region. Some people believe that thoracic spine metastases are most common. Others believe that the bone marrow within a lumbar spine is much more. And therefore, it is the lumbar spine which has the more common with more metastasis. Lumbar spine metastasis more commonly cause a lot of pain. In the thoracic spine, the rib cage supports the vertebral body, and therefore these patients don't get a lot of pain, and they often present directly with neurology. Metastasis on the cervical spine is rare. It is in about 8% of patients. The subdural or intradural metastasis are even less common. Within the vertebral body, the metastasis is much more common within the vertebral body than within the posterior elements. But you must remember that unlike in tuberculosis, where you see spread of the pus or infective granulation tissue subligamentous below the ALL, below the PLL, across the disc space, you do not find that in tumors. The disc is in fact resistant to metastatic invasion. 40% of patients with spinal metastasis are completely asymptomatic. So often it is detected by chance when you're investigating for something else. I've had 2 or 3 patients who came with back pain. We did an MRI and it turned out there was a metastatic lesion there. And when we further investigated, we found that in fact this patient had a renal cell cancer, which was undetected till then. Clinically, as the metastasis usually starts in the posterior half of the vertebral body, then involves the pedicle and makes the vertebral body weak. And therefore, there is pain, there is instability, there may be pathological fractures. And as the epidural space gets more and more obstructed, there may be a risk of neurologic deficit. And if multiple vertebrae are involved, thus you can find deformity. Any patient who has a thoracic pain, a night pain, a rest pain, a pain which is not mechanical, it is continuous in origin, not associated with posture, definitely needs further workup. A patient who complains of pain for the first time and his age is less than 20 or more than 60 years old, he requires attention also. All patients with any kind of pathologic fracture which is occurred without any trauma, one must rule out metastatic disease. Now that brings us to the next stage, that how do you investigate a patient who comes with a solitary vertebral collapse? Well, the steps are very clear. The first thing you do is try to delineate the local extent of the disease. Is the disease only in the vertebral body? Has it spread into the spinal canal? Has it spread in the tissues around the spine? So you want to find the local extent of the disease, and the investigations which help you best are an MRI scan and a CT scan. You then are looking for an etiology, and you want to see how much it has spread. To look for the spread of the tumor, one of the best investigations today is a CT PET scan. The CT PET scan, which is FDG with a FDG tracer isotope, is an extremely sensitive investigation which helps you to detect metastases which are even 2 millimeters big within the visceral or in the skeletal system. Also, to identify the origin of the unknown primary, the CT PET scan is extremely useful, but a number of blood tests, as I will outline later, are to be done. Usually, a biopsy is done following all other non-invasive investigations. If you do a biopsy before you've done an MRI or something, it may alter the MRI picture, and therefore it should be avoided. As a resident, what do you see on an X-ray? Well, on X-ray, you might find a lighting defect, which means destroyed bone. Or if this is a tumor which is throwing bone, like a prosthetic tumor, you might find osteoblastic lesion. As you can see, sclerosis or osteoblastic lesion in the right half of the pelvis here. You may find a pathological fracture of the vertebra over here. Or you may see a winking owl sign, which means that the pedicle is destroyed on one side, but you can see the eye of the pedicle on the other side, which is normal, and that is called as a winking owl sign. The limitations of X-rays are that 40% of lesions are missed on plain X-rays. Lesions can be only seen if they are more than 1 centimeter in size and when more than 50% of bone is lost. And of course, soft tissue lesions and epidural metastasis will not be seen. The investigation of choice initially is, of course, the MRI. The advantages: you can see early bone marrow infiltration. You can see the extent of bone destruction. You can see if there is any spread into the epidural space and whether there is any cord compression, any extension into the soft tissues. What you can also see, as you can see very clearly here, is tumor vascularity. You can actually see the blood vessel indicating that this is a very vascular tumor, or you may see flow voids like this, which indicate that the tumor is hyperintense and therefore vascular. And of course, you can pick up lesions along the spine, other lesions like you can see in this case over here, where you can see a problem. The next set of things to do are the blood tests. Hemoglobin is done. Often, most of these patients have anemia. Especially, you would find anemia in patients with multiple myeloma. Total WBC count is therapy or chemotherapy. The count may be reduced. Platelet counts may also be reduced. You must do a renal profile to look for the creatinine. You must do a liver function test in order to find out what's going on. Thyroid metastasis to the spine is not uncommon, so do thyroid function tests. Protein electrophoresis, multiple myeloma is the most common primary malignant tumor of the spine. Serum calcium phosphorus alkaline phosphatase, PSA levels in case of males, and if you're suspecting lymphoma, sometimes the LDH and uric acid are elevated. A CT scan is not commonly done in a patient in whom you are planning to treat non-operatively. However, the advantages of a CT scan is that it offers excellent bony delineation of the tumor. It detects cortical breach and predicts the possibility of impending vertebral collapse. However, the problem is that if you are looking for it to diagnose the tumor, then it is less sensitive than an MRI. It's difficult to assess the extent of soft tissue spread on a CT scan, and of course, radiation exposure is more. Brings us to nuclear imaging. In the past, all these things were tested with a technetium bone scan, which is an extremely good test for initial screening to look for skeletal metastasis and to differentiate these from other problems. However, what is now available in most places is a CT PET scan. Using an FDG isotope, it detects early glucose metabolism of the neoplastic cells within the bone and bone marrow. It has a 98% sensitivity in detecting the skeletal metastasis. It is more sensitive for detecting lytic mets than sclerotic mets and may help to differentiate between metastasis and osteoporotic vertebral fractures. What is available also for diagnostics is the possibility of doing a whole body MRI, which is an extremely good test because you can see both skeletal as well as visceral mets. However, it has a very long acquisition time, almost takes an hour, and is extremely expensive. That brings us finally to what we all were talking about, and that is biopsy. You must remember that whenever a lesion like this is there, there is no room for empirical treatment. The biopsy, even if it is a tumor, tells you what is the type of tumor, what is the gradation of the tumor, and how sensitive it is to chemo or radiotherapy. And therefore, histopathological confirmation must always be done. There are various methods of biopsy: USG guided, CT guided, which is an FNAC, a transpedicular core biopsy, or finally, sometimes we do an open biopsy when a patient is paralyzed or something, and you already are planning to do a surgery for this patient. Then you do an excisional biopsy in these patients. That brings us to the treatment. What is the treatment option for these patients? You must remember that when the tumor has already metastatized, it means that this is already stage 4. It has already spread beyond its confines, and it's a systemic disease, which most of the times you are not able to control or cure completely. And therefore, the management of the tumor is primarily aimed at palliation. Palliation means that you have to make the patient comfortable and functional in the time duration that is the patient is alive. That is, you try to improve the patient's quality of life, but at an acceptable risk. The options for palliation include just simple pain control. You know this patient is going to live for 3 to 4 weeks. There is no point in doing fancy surgery. Instead, it might be worthwhile just giving adequate pain relief so that the patient can live a comfortable life. The other options are, of course, chemotherapy, which is done by the oncologists. But from our point of view, what is important in chemotherapy is steroids and bisphosphonates. The steroids which are used are helpful because they reduce the tumor size by reducing the edema, and they are very useful around the time when radiotherapy is given, because the tumor cells necrose and the tumor swells up and can cause actually worsening of the neurology temporarily. Also, in patients with whom you are embolizing, steroids are given peri-embolization in order to reduce the edema that comes along. Bisphosphonates, of course, most oncologists start this, but it reduces the incidence of skeletal mets. The decision about chemotherapy and radiotherapy is made by the oncologists. And of course, there are various types of surgery: decompression alone, decompression plus stabilization, reconstructive spinal surgery, vertebroplasty, kyphoplasty. Decompression alone means a laminectomy alone, which was a common surgery in the past. Today, nobody does decompression alone for metastatic tumors for fear of causing a pathological fracture. So as I said, palliation, you must weigh the surgical morbidity, the anticipated survival of the patient against the quality of life in order to justify surgical intervention. Now, once you think about surgery, or once you have started treatment, you are thinking whether is surgery the best way or is radiotherapy the best way to treat this. Radiation helps because it reduces the size of the tumor mass, it reduces the bone pain, and in fact the tumor may melt and relieve the neurological compression. In the past, when laminectomy was the standard of treatment for patients with spinal tumors, studies were conducted comparing laminectomy with radiation, and it was concluded that radiation therapy is far superior to surgery. They found that there were equivalent rates of improving or maintaining neurology and ambulation and lesser morbidity. However, today, modern treatment is very different. When you did laminectomy alone, the disease is anteriorly within the vertebral body, And it's impossible through a laminectomy in the thoracic spine to approach the anterior vertebral body without retracting the neural structures. And therefore, anterior decompression was not adequate, so it didn't really help. Also, in a patient who already has vertebral body disease, the possibility of a pathological fracture, a laminectomy created a globally unstable disease, and therefore patients had more pain, more pathological fractures, and therefore it was concluded that radiation therapy is better than surgery. Today, we do these surgeries with stabilization so that pathological fractures don't occur. We go posterolaterally rather than centrally like a laminectomy. We go through a transpedicular approach. Without retracting the dural sac and the neural structures, we can approach the anterior elements and do our job. And therefore, if you look at literature today, it is very clear that modern spine surgery is superior to radiotherapy alone. Studies by Sundaresan and all show that the neurological improvement rate following surgery followed by radiotherapy is almost 70%. Another study by Regine et al. Showed that comparing radiotherapy against surgery plus radiotherapy, surgery plus radiotherapy had greater rates of ambulation recovery and maintenance and decreased use of narcotics. A study by Patchell, which was showed that the overwhelming evidence in favor of surgery, so much so that the study had to be stopped in the middle because people believed that you cannot let the patient suffer without surgery. They showed better urinary function, better motor outcomes, higher rate of return to ambulation, and patients were able to walk and live pain-free and mobile for much longer than if you just gave radiotherapy alone. Which finally brings us to the surgery part, which is what most of us as orthopedic surgeons or spine surgeons are interested in. And that is surgery. Now, surgery can have very gratifying outcomes and you can improve the life of this patient, but judicious selection of the patient is vital. And therefore, you have to ask yourself the questions why, when, who, and what. Why should I operate? Well, you're operating because you want to improve quality of life. You don't want to cure the tumor. You can't. You are not able to treat the systemic disease. You are only trying to treat the pathology at that level in the spine. You are doing it to control pain, which you can do in 50 to 80% of the patients, and to improve the neurology, so that even 30% of bedridden patients may improve. Pain is controlled by resecting the tumor, decompressing the nerve roots, and stabilizing pathological fractures. On the other hand, neurology can be improved by decompressing the neural structures and stabilizing the spine. Harrington, way back in the 1970s, gave a classification based on which he said you could decide about treatment. He divided spinal metastatic tumors into 5 types. The first one, there was no evidence of any neurologic deficit. Here he suggested that only chemo or radiotherapy is enough. If there was bone involvement without collapse, but no neurologic deficit, still the treatment would be chemo and radiotherapy. If the patient had a neurological involvement, but there was no vertebral involvement, the treatment would be radiation plus steroids. However, the moment there was a problem with pathological fracture of the vertebral body, instability, or a significant neurologic deficit, then the treatment moved on to surgery. So today, primarily surgery is done when the tumor we know is a radio-resistant type of tumor. That is, it is not sensitive to radiation, sarcomas, renal cell cancers, lung cancers, colon cancers. If there is a pathological fracture with retropulse bone in the canal causing a neural compression, or if there is spinal instability, if there is a high-grade epidural tumor which is circumferentially compressing the dural sac, you must go in early. An occult primary tumor, you don't know where it is coming from, you want to find out. And of course, there are severe neurological symptoms. In all others, you would think of first giving radiation therapy or chemotherapy. However, if for any reason these treatments fail and you see that there is progression of neurologic symptoms, radiographic tumor progression or spinal instability, you must think of secondary surgery. The question is, should you do radiotherapy first or should you do surgery first? And there was a beautiful paper by Gogawala where he divided patients with malignant spinal cord compression into 3 groups: radiotherapy alone, radiotherapy followed by surgery, and surgery followed by radiotherapy. And they found that the wound complication rate, once you give that area a radiotherapy, the fibrous cells, the cells in that area become fibrotic, tissue becomes fibrotic. And that never changes. Even if you wait for 6 months or a year, it doesn't, it's lifelong. So therefore, if you once you've given radiotherapy, the chances of wound healing reduce. And it was found major wound complication rate was 3 times higher in the group that had radiation before the surgery. It was also found that the chances of neurological healing were poorer in patients who had radiotherapy first rather than if surgery was followed by radiotherapy. The next thing to consider, whom should you operate? Now you've decided why you want to operate, when you want to operate, you have to decide who is the patient who is perfect for operation. And the things to consider are the tumor and the prognosis of the tumor, the type of neurologic deficit, and the general condition of the patient. If the patient has a life expectancy which is less than 6 weeks or 2 months, then usually there is no point in doing. By the time he recovers from your surgery, the chances are that he will have died. So there is no point in subjecting this patient to an unnecessary operation. Also depends on the type of tumor. If the tumor is very chemosensitive or radiosensitive, like round cell tumors, Ewing's tumors, PNETs, multiple myeloma, lymphoma, these will respond beautifully to adjuvant therapy, and therefore you may not require to think of surgery on a patient like that. There are a number of scoring systems which have been outlined, starting with Tomita, then Tokuhashi, then modified Tokuhashi, then Kodibanger. There are a number of such scoring systems available. Traditionally, I have followed the Tokuhashi scoring system. It consists of 6 parts: Karnofsky performance status, which means what is the patient's ability to self-care. And based on that, the patient is given 0, 1, or 2 points. The number of extraspinal bony mates, that is bony mates outside of the spine. If there are none, you give the patient 2 points. 1 or 2, you give 1 point. 3 or more, no, 0 points. The number of vertebral mates, metastasis to major internal organs, the primary site of tumor. Now it is known that patients with lung cancer or stomach cancer have a very poor prognosis, so they are given 0 points. Kidney, liver, uterus are moderately good, and therefore they get an intermediate score. And thyroid, prostate, and breast have the best prognosis, and therefore they get the maximum points. It is also seen that patients who develop a neurologic deficit survive less than patients who do not. So if they have no deficit, they get 2 points, incomplete gets 1, and a complete gets 0 points. So the total score, when you compare everything as 2 points, 6 groups, 12 points is the maximum you can get. If the number of points is less than 5, then the chances that this patient will survive for more than 3 months is very poor. Patients with 6 to 8 points generally survive up to 1 year, and 9 or more usually have 1 year or more of survival. The next thing to look at is the neurologic deficit. If there is a complete cord lesion, which is of more than 24 hours duration, it is unlikely to recover, and operating on these patients does not make much sense. Rapidity of onset, like this girl whom I showed you as an example for biopsy, that girl had a rapid onset of paraplegia overnight. And if you look at the cord compression, it had not worsened and it was not severe. So there was a very good chance that there may be a tumor embolization of the spinal artery which had caused this paraplegia. And this type of a vascular compromise is unlikely to recover. Finally, what you look at is the severity of the deficit. If the deficit is mild, the chances of recovery are better. The more severe the deficit, the chances of recovery are not only poorer, but even if they do recover, the time taken to recover is so long that by that time the patient is ready to die. So what is the point of operating? The other thing you must look for is the general condition. How many comorbidities does the patient have? Is the patient in good physical health or is the patient fragile? And one factor which has been shown consistently to affect is the age of the patient. The more the age of the patient, the lesser is the chance of patient coming out of the surgery very well. Finally, it brings us to what should we actually do for these patients. Tomita helps us with this dilemma of what. Tomita declassified metastatic tumors into 2 types. Those which are within the bone, either vertebral body, pedicle, or lamina, these are called intracompartment. or those that are in the soft tissue or in the epidural space. These are called as extracompartmental lesions. So he made seven types of pathologies. Type 1, 2, or 3 were intraosseous lesions, which were intracompartmental, either involving one region or two regions within the spine. And extracompartmental were those which had either of the 1, 2, or 3, but now they were involving either the epidural space, the paravertebral space, or an adjacent vertebra. And type 7 were skip lesions. Based on this, Cody Bunger from Sweden proposed the following rule. He said if the Tokuhashi score is 0 to 4, the life expectancy is less than 3 months. Irrespective of what the patient has, don't try to do too much for this patient. Just do a laminectomy or a laminectomy plus fixation. Don't try to do too aggressive a surgery. Now, if the Tokuhashi score is 5 to 8, the life expectancy is a little better. Irrespective of the Tomita score, you go and do a decompression and stabilization. And if the vertebral body is destroyed, you reconstruct it. Don't try to do major A-block surgery or anything. On the other hand, if the Tokuhashi score is 9 to 12, the life expectancy is more than 6 months. And then based on the Tomita type, the treatment is decided. If the Tomita type is 1 to 3, that is the lesion is completely intraosseous, then it's worthwhile taking the entire tumor out in one block and resecting the tumor and reconstructing the vertebra. So here you would think about marginal or wide margins. Type 4 to 6, where there is extracompartmental lesion, you go intra-lesional, you debulk the tumor, and then you reconstruct and stabilize the spine. And in type 7, which is where there are skip lesions, only decompression plus stabilization. This is the stage in which most of our Indian patients come to us, that they've already got skip lesions, multiple lesions, and then we are left with just stabilizing these patients for pain relief. When you talk about surgery, there are 5 steps. Step 1, if it's a vascular tumor, you need to embolize the vascular tumor. Then you think about excising the tumor in whichever method you feel comfortable. Step 3 is reconstruction of the defect that you have created because you've excised the tumor. Step 4 is restoration of the spinal stability. And finally, once you've done all this, 2 to 3 weeks later, you can think of giving this patient chemo or radiotherapy. So let's go stepwise. What is embolization? Embolization means that these tumors often have a lot of blood vessels which go into the tumor. If you can block the blood vessel to the tumor, then what you can do is reduce the blood supply to the tumor, causing reduction in intraoperative blood loss, maximizing tumor resection. You can reduce the mass effect, the tumor shrinks in size, it improves the cord decompression and alleviates the pain. Embolization is usually done by an interventional radiologist within 24 to 48 hours of the planned surgical procedure. Typically, they use either gel foam, which is temporary, where you must do the surgery within 12 to 24 hours, or they use beads or coils, PVC beads or coils to block the artery. In the good old days, embolization used to be of the segmental vessels. This was dangerous because it often related in cord infarct. Today, embolization, they are so beautifully done that it is called a super selective embolization. They can actually go and only block the vessel which is supplying the tumor and reduce the bleeding. You must be careful as a physician not to operate, or a surgeon not to operate immediately after. Wait for a few hours, because these patients may often develop a worsening of the neurology and then it will be blamed on you. So wait and check the patient's neurology before you go for the surgery. Also, administer steroids around the time of the embolization so that this problem of drop in neurology does not come in. There are certain tumors which are known to be hypervascular, where you must always embolize. These are renal cell cancers, thyroid cancers, neuroendocrine tumors, sarcomas, and chordomas, or giant cell tumors, which is not a metastatic tumor. On the other hand, there are some MRI findings which suggest to you that this may be a hypervascular. Like you can see, there is a flow void over here. There is intense enhancement on contrast images or intratumoral hemorrhage. These signs suggest that this may be a very vascular tumor, and these tumors need to be embolized. The second step in this is excision of the spinal tumor. That means removal of the tumor itself. And here we go back to our undergraduate experience knowledge of margins. Whenever you think of excising a tumor, you can excise it within the tumor, leaving gross macroscopic tumor in there. This is what is called as essentially a debulking of the tumor. The second type of margin is a marginal margin, where you go along the pseudocapsule, but you're still leaving satellite lesions outside of the tumor within the same vertebra. The third type of margin is a wide margin. It's an en bloc excision outside the pseudocapsule, but in the spine, you're still leaving the spinal cord and the vessels and everything intact. And this involves much more effort. And the final type of margin is a radical margin, which is an en bloc excision of the whole compartment. And sometimes in these cases, blood vessels, nerves, etc. have to be sacrificed. Here is a patient. This patient was operated by a spine colleague of mine in Bombay. He was a young 18-year-old boy who had a sarcoma on the foot, which had metastasized to the spine at D5-6. This patient was operated with an intralesional margin. You can see beautiful surgery, anterior transthoracic approach. And this patient had a stable fixation, patient improved, pain went down. But within 2 months, you can see the MRI on the right side, entire tumor had grown back. And in fact, the tumor had grown all along the incision that was taken previously. So when you do intralesional tumor excision and subsequently there is no adequate chemo or radiotherapy to protect you, then the tumor recurrence rates are as high as 40%, which can occur at the same or another level. And when the tumor grows back, it may result in loss of fixation, recurrent pain, and neurologic deficit. Total en bloc spondylectomy is a surgery which is primarily done for a primary tumor of the spine and not for metastatic tumors. However, there are certain metastatic tumors where it is a solitary vertebral mets, there is a well-controlled systemic disease, then we do think of doing an en bloc resection. The advantage is you are doing a near complete excision of the diseased tissue. There is minimal seeding locally, longer disease-free survival, and better pain control, better neurology, and better disease control. The limitations is it's a massive procedure, extensive blood loss, a huge risk of infection, instability, neural tears, neurologic deficit, and then it is technically demanding operation. The third step is reconstructing the defect. Now you have removed the tumor. 80% or 90% of the tumors involve the vertebral body. We also know that 80% of the loads of the spine are borne by the anterior column in the spine. And therefore, the anterior defect needs to be restored so as to allow load bearing. Now, the defect can be restored by using autografts or allografts. The problem with autografts is that subsequently the patient is going to get chemotherapy or radiotherapy. And therefore, this autograft often doesn't heal. It necroses. It becomes a dead sclerotic piece of bone over there. And therefore, patient may die before actually fusion occurs. In order to prevent this problem, in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of people started using PMMA, that is bone cement, along with some kind of a Steinman pin or coaxial in double lumen intercostal tubes, etc., were used, and the bone cement was used as a spacer. The advantage was cement is low cost. It provided immediate stability, so patient could be mobilized. So there were a lot of advantages of this. The disadvantage of using cement is sometimes cement can leak backwards into the canal, and that can cause either cord compression or even thermal injury to the spinal cord. The other disadvantage is the cement blocks may extrude, the cement may fracture. These are some of the problems. So the next stage came in with the use of interbody cages, either using cages which expand in situ or things like the Ham mesh in the center over here, which will act as a strut and help with restoring the defect. The next step, of course, is to restore you have now reconstructed the defect, but you need to restore the stability of the spine to prevent abnormal loading movement at the site of instability. That is neutralizing the entire forces acting over there. The problem here is that there is a contrary between doing too little and too much. If you do too little, the tumor may spread and you will land up in problems. If you do too much, the patient is going to have more morbidity, because often multiple adjacent vertebrae are involved. associated osteoporosis secondary to disease. Disease continues even after surgical extirpation. So here is an example, a solitary renal cell cancer involving only the anterior vertebra, where I have done an anterior approach, put screws above, below, and the patient did well. This was a lung cancer which had metastatized to multiple levels. She had severe pain. She was not able to sit up. We did a multi-level stabilization and from the back and helped the patient. Finally, sometimes you may require a combined anterior plus posterior approach. What about minimally invasive surgery in spinal tumors? The goal is to decrease morbidity and recovery time, initiate adjuvant treatment early. So there are a lot of new things which have come in. One is stereotactic radiosurgery. I'll be speaking a bit about it. Limited open decompression tumor excision with endoscopy, microendoscopy is being done. In tumors which are causing pain and there is a possibility of collapse, one can do a vertebroplasty or a kyphoplasty for pain relief. Along with radiofrequency ablation, this is extremely helpful. In recent times, it has been discovered that in patients who have weak bones which are likely to collapse or which have already have pain because of the collapse, one can do a vertebroplasty or a kyphoplasty in order to provide pain relief. And therefore, in patients with painful pathological fractures without a neurologic deficit or significant canal extension of the tumor, one can think of doing a vertebroplasty. You can do it when you know how to identify an impending pathological fracture. And in patients who have already got paraplegia, they have nothing to lose, right? They still have a lot of pain, you can do vertebroplasty. How do you identify patients who have a possibility of collapse? It has been shown that if the costovertebral joint is involved, the tumor occupancy within the vertebral body is more than about 60% in the thoracic spine and 35 to 40% in the lumbar spine, then you could think of that this is probably an unstable and is likely to collapse. If the pedicle, one or both sides are destroyed and the patient has low BMD, these are all features which suggest the impending collapse. Here is a patient of mine. This was actually a multiple myeloma who had severe back pain, multiple level pathological fractures. He was not able to sit, lie down in bed, had not slept in bed for 3 months because of the severe pain. We did a multiple level vertebroplasty. This patient went on to do extremely well and completely pain-free till she died. Finally, going to spinal radiosurgery. There are various types of radiotherapy which is given. Radiotherapy can be brachytherapy, where you insert a chip, and but this is used for tumors which are accessible and which are small in size. Then you have external beam radiotherapy, which can be given in a collimated manner, or it can be done by a stereotactic method. The advantage of the problem with typical radiotherapy is that when you give radiotherapy, you're not able to deliver the radiation dose precisely to the pathological tissue. It spreads along the adjacent tissue also, creating problems over there. The spinal cord has low tolerance to radiation. And therefore, when you are trying to destroy the tumor, the spinal cord may be affected. And therefore, you have to reduce the dose, which is below the optimum therapeutic level for that tumor. Stereotactic image-guided delivery, you can actually deliver radiation precisely to the tumor tissue, reducing the amount of radiation to adjacent organs. And therefore, its advantages are percutaneous, it's minimum morbidity, excellent pain relief, long-term control, and treatment is often completed in a single sitting. So finally, after this long 45-minute lecture, I'm going to conclude. Why do we operate? We operate simply, we are not trying to cure the tumor. The goal of our treatment is alleviation of pain, improving function by preserving neurology. When do we operate? When do we need to do surgery? When can radiotherapy or chemotherapy not be given? If they are radio-resistant tumors, if patient has a significant neurologic deficit, if there are pathological fractures and instability. Who should you operate on? When the anticipated survival time is more than 3 months. And what gives us a guidance? The patient's medical comorbidities, the age of the patient, the type of neurologic deficit, the type of primary tumor are all features which help us to decide which one you want to operate on. And when you operate today, you must remember that there is no role for decompression alone, except in possibly metastasis into purely epidural metastasis or intradural metastasis. If there is any involvement of the vertebra or pedicle, it is safer to stabilize these patients in the long run. So my final message to all of you is the goal as a spine surgeon when you treat these patients is to be godly. You want to be able to help this patient, but don't think you're God and you can cure everybody. I think in my practice over the last 20 years, I have seen more than 4 to 500 metastatic tumors, and I must have operated only about 100, 150. So majority of them you are refusing because they don't fulfill the criteria for surgery. Thank you. So I'll stop here. I will take questions from the audience and then we'll move on to the case presentations.